Merci beaucoup de l'invitation et de l'opportunité de venir m'entretenir avec vous sur ce sujet des métadonnées musicales. Remercier Philippe tout particulièrement. Je voudrais aussi dire que j'anticipe avec grand intérêt le fait qu'il y aura une publication scientifique au terme de cet exercice aussi. Et j'ai bien hâte donc de pouvoir me livrer à cet exercice. Aujourd'hui, ce que je vous présente, c'est beaucoup plus schématique. C'est un sujet d'ordre socio-technique, je dirais, beaucoup d'éléments de technologie. J'espère que ce ne sera pas trop pénible ou aride pour certains d'entre vous. Je vais essayer de passer au travers assez rapidement, puis on complétera par les questions s'il y a des éléments qui vous échappent et qui vous piquent la curiosité. J'ai préparé la présentation en français, donc je vais la faire en anglais de façon à ce que les gens qui sont francophones puissent suivre à l'écran, mais que les gens qui sont unilingues anglais puissent comprendre ce dont il s'agit. Je m'appelle Jean-Robert Bisaillon. Vous pouvez en savoir plus sur moi en allant ici à About Me. Essentiellement, si vous voulez revoir aussi ce que je vous présente, vous allez à l'adresse bit.ly/Musimorphoses. Vous aurez cette présentation, donc vous pourrez aller la consulter après l'événement. Vous n'avez pas besoin de prendre de notes. Donc, le contenu, essentiellement, on va partir d'hypothèses. Je vais vous parler de l'enquête initiale qui a fait l'objet de mon essai de maîtrise. Je vais ajouter des éléments d'actualisation je vais cristalliser autour d'un enjeu sectoriel que je nomme la transmission initiale. On va regarder des logiciels, on va regarder la problématique des identifiants uniques. Essentially, I will present my initial study, and I will actualize it with new elements that occurred in the last like 3-4 years. And I will crystallize everything around an industrial challenge that is facing us right now that I'm calling initial transmission or initial indexing. Metadata essentially is descriptive information, as you might know. So it gives us the source, it gives us the creator's name, which is extremely important on my behalf because I am a music composer. It will give you elements of context, and it will give you all sorts of information, documentation associated with the works, which is fundamental, I believe. I think that these information are kind of a guarantee of the future remuneration of creators and the renewal of the offer. If we don't remunerate creators, there won't be original content being proposed. There could be mashup, there could be all sorts of creative gestures, but we will lack some sort of originality coming from professional creators. It's also a challenge about cultural diversity because as lots of people have expressed it during the last 3 days, if we don't entail cultural diversity, I mean, these recommendation systems tend to offer you the same proposals all the time. And the question I haven't answered yet, but I'm sure could be of interest for some of you guys, is there interest on the listener's behalf to get this information? And I haven't seen any study on this subject. There might be, but since I'm not in university anymore, I don't know. But I'm often told by people in the industry that people don't care who plays the bass, and people don't care where it was recorded, in which country or whatever, which your presentation yesterday said the opposite, kind of. The localization of the proposal is extremely important. One thing we know, though, is that if people are not interested in those things, robots are interested in those things. So initially, the study came to the conclusion that there was a lack of understanding of what was music metadata. That was the first finding. The second finding was we were facing a very complex chain of stakeholders, a very complex value chain. There's telecommunication industry, there's programmers, there's people listening to music, there's people writing music, there's download stores, there's streaming proposal, and libraries, and all these guys tend to use different semantics and different databases. They're not interconnected. The third finding was that there was no discussion among those actors. Everyone was evolving in their own circles, in their own silos, without talking to each other. And the fourth fact was that there was also external conditions that would affect that, namely money, competencies, but essentially money and policies to try and foster cooperation and discussions. In 2016, we can be sure of one thing, is that there's a race, a progress race, there's a competitive race on metadata. We'll see more in detail. But there's the traditional public rights organization who are really trying to get their act together in terms of dealing with metadata. We also have new for-profit rights collective that are becoming being birthed right now. It's totally new to have or relatively, in the States you could have a few, but it's relatively new that we see rights management corporation. In the past it was a collective management system. We see streaming platforms, streaming loads and loads of content. We see huge users like Google and Apple. And we see also third party who are starting to make sense into this by studying compartmental and studying usage logs coming from those aggregators, those music platforms playing the music. So you have a company here in France called Transparency Rights Management who's trying to make sense with all this data. What we are currently saying is that if we want real value to come out of music consumption and listening in the future, we will have to attach as much importance to the metadata that is linked to a master than the audio master itself. In the past, don't take away the master from a musician. It's like pulling out his highs, or making him deaf, which is even worse for a musician. The master was extremely important, obviously, because it was a zero copy of all his work. So I believe that now metadata is as much important as the master itself. Okay, this is kind of dense. So just to show you that there's several initiatives right now, and it's kind of the current research is on this. There's a global repertoire database and a collective initiative that has just failed. There's new consortium in the US and in Europe called MusicMark and ICE who are trying to aggregate information. There's Fast Track and CISAC, which is the Confédération Internationale des Sociétés d'Auteurs, which is an international federation of authors and composers, who are working also on refining their unique identifiers. I will speak more about unique identifiers later. There's the Médiation Schwartz in France with a working group on metadata. There's a report on opening cultural metadata in France. There's a report in Boston, the Berkeley Rethink Music report, who talks about metadata. There's a new DDEX exchange protocol who's about to be born in early 2016, again on how to make song declarations. There's also a group of which I'm part of that is trying to create certification for fair trade music right now. Obviously, certification for fair trade music will have to base itself on information, so on metadata. And there is a current revision of an important identifier, which is an identifier for all recordings, which is the ISRC. There's a current revision process of this identifier. And so, and blah, blah, blah. And there's two software projects that are currently on the move to try and cope with this from the creator's angle. And one of them is my project. It's called TGiT, T-G-I-T. And there's another one in Sweden called Oddly. And I'll speak more about those as well. So there's a real race right now to cope with this type of information. The actual industry challenge that is not seen by every industry stakeholders, because some of them might not have the interest of seeing this thing thrive, is the notion of initial transmission. So what we're saying is that if the creators themselves don't send down the information in the value chain, every intermediaries will try at some point to make sense of this music content, and they will attach information on the content even though they are not competent to do it because they haven't written it or composed it. At the Siam Congress in October, le Conseil International des Créateurs de Musique, which is the writers and composers branch of CISAC, I was moderating a dialogue with Oddly, the others, the Sweden software project, and we kind of crystallized our concept around the idea of at the source indexing, which means right at the time of creation or as closely as possible to the moment of creation. Lately, at the Future of Music Coalition Policy Summit in Washington, D.C. in October, there was a citation by Kristen Thompson on Twitter, which Kristen is the co-founder of the Future of Music Coalition Policy Summit. She reinforced this, so we're a bunch of people coming to the same kind of conclusion. She said, metadata, musicians, managers, labels need to invest in data management and proper IDs before release date for best result. If you don't do this before release date, your content is going all the way in the system, in the networks, with improper information on them. So it has bad consequences both for the listeners and for the rights owners. It's a real chaos. Okay, so software and identifiers. So I spoke fast. I mentioned Oddly already. Oddly is working on a software to give the opportunity to musicians in the studio environment to tag the metadata to what they're currently doing. And they're essentially building this around 4 identifiers. The identifiers are numerical values or alphanumerical values, which are machine readable. The thing is, at this point in time, there's so much occurrence, usage of music. There's so many songs and so many events happening that the log sheets coming from the music users are humongous. It's millions and millions and millions of lines with a price tag of 0.002 and 0.008 money values to them. So everyone's going crazy. The money is stuck into bank accounts. And there's projects right now who are thriving big time financially, but can't bring the value down to the rights owner. It's stuck in bank accounts, or it's stuck in bad faith. So the unique IDs are extremely important to identify all the key stakeholders in the chain in order to make sense of what we're actually listening to. It's very technical, but in the end, it drives the whole, I mean, it has consequences on the social aspect of music consumption. So Oddly is trying to use the IPI and is currently negotiating country by country to get the authorization to use the IPI, which is the the creators and publishers identifiers. So all, c'est l'identifiant public international des auteurs, compositeurs et éditeurs de musique. So music publishers and writers have an IPI, and this IPI is kind of their digital imprint. And currently, Audley is trying to get these IPIs for existing creators from the collective societies who actually manage these IPIs in order to be able to put these IPIs in the song right at the start. But there's no central database for that worldwide. So they have to negotiate country by country. So it could take forever. What we need to know is the IPI is a creation of SISAC, which is, again, this international federations of societies of creators. And they're currently reviewing and looking into their unique IDs and the way to obtain those unique IDs. They're aware of this kind of problem associated with the fact that we cannot access these IDs easily at the time of creation. The IPI is a private ID identifier. It's a privately owned identifier owned by SISAC. But currently, what we should know also is Music Brains, which is a crowdsourced database that everyone can cooperate and collaborate with, is, whenever they have the chance, reaping the web to find these IPIs and to add them onto their public database. So this IPI is public, but it's not so well protected. There's some work being done right now by third party trying to expose this information. Music Brains database is 15 million recording, but there's only 638,000 works that in it. So they have 15 million recordings, but only 638 works. You know you understand the difference between the work and the recording. And there's always a work behind the recording, underlying a recording. The recording is just a recorded manifestation of a work. And they only have 95,000 ISWC at this point, which is the identifier for the work, International Standard Work Code. And SysNet, which is the database of SISAC, has 66 million works. So these are the figures that we're trying to cope with at this point in time. There's also a protocol called DDEX. It's an international consortium trying to create a REN format, which is Recording Information Notification. It is brand new. They're currently receiving proposals on this. It's also along the lines of at-the-source indexing. So yet another partner or another stakeholder is looking into at-the-source indexing. But how can the REM format work? How can this format work if, again, the IPIs are not available? So same problem as Audley. The ISWC code, the work code, cannot be issued if you don't have all the creators' IPIs when you do the declaration. So currently publishers declare songs and send out stuff without the ISWC identifier on it because they can't access it because the IPIs at the start is not available as well. So there's a domino effect on the declaration chain, which makes what we say in English, shit in, shit out. It's a nice one. I like those gross terms. There's another one which is very interesting, and that's kind of my conclusion, or we're coming close to the conclusion. The International Standard Name Identifier is a public identity identifier. And we're trying to match it with the actual IPI, but there's resistance because there's some private information, there's beliefs that there's some confidential information to be accessed through the IPI, and there's kind of people are kind of watching each other in a weird ways, trying to figure out if they should or could match the IPI and the ISNI. What is interesting about the ISNI is that it's accessible online, so you can go and query the ISNI anytime you want. Sure it is. And it's also machine queryable, so you can use APIs to query this identifier. You can also allocate a new ISNI to someone or a public identity who doesn't have an ISNI. You can allocate an ISNI in real time using an API, which means that if you're in the studio and you're using the proper kind of software, you will be able to allocate an ISNI to someone who just walked in, even if he doesn't have an ISNI. Then the idea of the ISNI is actually to see it as a bridge identifier, which we'll use later on to try and map the information together based on the ISNI. And this is the code on which my software project is built. We're actually retrieving existing ISNI, or we're allocating ISNI to people who don't have one. So this is my project. I will not go into depth into this, but if you want to see how it works, how it manages itself, you just have to go back to the presentation and go look for it. It's called, as I said, Tag It. So essentially, that's what I wanted to say. Is like the ISNI is my hypothèse at this point to try and make sense in all this mess, but we don't know yet if everyone along the value chain is really interested to make sense out of this mess. That's the big question. And the ISNI was originally a CSAC initiative, but at the current time, we don't know yet if they're gonna invest time and effort in promoting this identifier. We don't know. This guy is François-Xavier Nuttall. He was a counsel at CSAC and pronounced this allocution in 2008, if we can see it. I don't think we will be able to. It's spinning. Yeah, because I'm not connected to the web. So François-Xavier Nuttall was a counsel at CSAC, and in 2008, he explained how important finding a bridge identifier to try and solve these issues was to be. And he since then doesn't work at CSAC anymore. He works at Google. But I don't want to make any connection between the both, because people have to work in order to buy food and in order to survive. So I'm not sure if there's a connection to be made. I haven't asked him yet. I had my first exchange with him yesterday. He was a difficult person to get a hold of, but he did confirm me that this whole issue was still of actuality, that it was still extremely important to address it, even though it's been in the cardboards for 7 years now. Thank you.